Hello, Year 11. Now, obviously, we're going to be continuing our revision through our online learning, but first of all, I just wanted to make it clear what we're going to be moving on to next. Now, clearly, you guys have just finished 2 weeks looking at the League of Nations as part of your conflict topic, and obviously, before that point, before Christmas, we also did look at a number of different topics as well, including the first one for Germany, which was the Kaiser. We've also finished looking at the Treaty of Versailles, and we've also started looking at some of the themes of health and the people. What we're about to look at next is Germany and Weimar. This is going to take us 2 weeks, and as you can see from the boxes on the right hand side, you can see that this is going to take 6 lessons, and it can even inform you as to what we're going to be doing in each of those lessons. Clearly, we're going to be starting today's lesson with knowledge, and that will help you to answer some exam plans, and it will also help you to inform you for the short answer test and the exam. We're going to be very much continuing as we did with the last 2 weeks on conflict, where you will be doing an online short answer test as you did last time, and we're also going to be doing an exam as well, where you can get some feedback from your teachers too. So let's get started. So we're now going to spend this lesson going over the knowledge for Weimar Germany, which is the second topic within our Germany scheme, which the entire Germany scheme goes from 1890 to 1945. We've already finished looking at the Kaiser's rule, so we're going to move now on to Weimar Germany. So before we get started going through the knowledge, I want you to just stop now and think about what you can remember about Weimar Germany and use these bullet points on the slide to help you. So there's a number of different things here that hopefully will jog your memory. For example, can you remember much about the Weimar's constitutional weaknesses? Can you remember much about the crisis years from 1919 to 1923? Think about any political problems that existed and economic problems that existed in those years. Can you think of anything about the golden years? For example, who was in charge at that time? What key minister do we talk about in the golden years? Also, when we think about the golden years, can you think of any examples of political improvement, economic improvement, or improvements in international relations? There are also some examples of cultural improvements. Can you think of any examples? And finally, we're going to be finishing this topic by looking at why does Hitler become Chancellor in 1933? Can you think of any reasons why he does? There are a number of different reasons for why people voted for Hitler. To give you a bit of a clue, can you think of any reasons why people voted for Hitler? What do you think were the most important reasons? Once you've obviously had a think about this, we can then move on. You might want to pause this video for now so you can have a good think for yourself. Okay, Year 11, so before we begin, I just want to make it clear that just like last time, you can print off the information sheets from Share My Homework if you have access to a printer, and therefore you can highlight as we go through the PowerPoint. But if you don't have access to a printer, that's absolutely fine. Just grab a piece of paper and make some bullet pointed notes instead. We're going to be starting with the establishment of the Weimar Republic, and particularly talking about the Constitution. Now, the Constitution basically means the set of rules by which the government is run, and of course this will be very different now that there is a new democratic government, whereas before we know that obviously the Kaiser, who had inherited his power, had a very different style of constitution. Now, the new constitution was set up by August 1919, and we also know that in terms of this constitution, there are a number of key people that we need to be aware of and talk a little bit about their roles. So first of all, we know that the Kaiser, who was previously the head of state, had been replaced by an elected president. Now, this is quite different because the Kaiser previously inherited his power, whereas the president was elected by the people every 7 years. Now, the president would be the new head of state, so he would be the person that is kind of the top in terms of power, and they would also control the chancellor and the government essentially, and they also would have extra powers like Article 48, which we'll talk about on the next few slides. So we also need to think about who could vote for the president. Well, all men and women over 20 could now vote. This was much more fair than it was under the Kaiser, where only men over 25 could vote. So now younger people could vote and also women as well, meaning there was more votes being counted. One thing that is important though is that they used a system of proportional representation. This basically meant that every vote counted, and we'll talk a bit more about that on the next slide, so I'm not going to dwell on that right now. The other person you need to be aware of is the Chancellor. Now, the Chancellor was actually more powerful now. He wasn't elected by the Kaiser, as had previously been done. Instead, the Chancellor was also elected by the people. And the Chancellor was in charge of the day-to-day runnings of government, so quite a lot like our current Prime Minister. And also, they were in charge of the now powerful Reichstag. The Reichstag also now had more powers to pass and create laws. It's also important we know that the Germans themselves had more freedoms. So, for example, they had the rights to freedom of speech, free political opinion, and freedom of religion. Now, this is something that wasn't necessarily available under the Kaiser. Certainly, political opinion and freedom of speech were not really praised under the Kaiser. And censorship was no longer a problem anymore. This means that the press could now speak openly about their opinions, particularly when it came to politics. Now, Germany was actually one of the most democratic systems in government, but in some ways it was too democratic for the German people. Let's not forget the German people hadn't opted for democracy, they had had it forced upon them by the defeat in World War One, and that certainly meant that the Weimar Republic started off with shaky foundations. Let's now go on to look at some of the issues that the Weimar Republic faced. Okay, so the first political problem we're going to talk about is the constitutional weaknesses, and the first of these constitutional weaknesses was proportional representation. Now remember that that means the percentage of votes equals the percentage of seats. Now that of course means that every single vote counted, and that's one of the reasons why people might say that the Weimar Republic was too democratic, because what this then meant was that if every vote counted, it resulted in lots of different political parties. Lots of smaller parties came out of the woodwork from getting a few votes from the Germans. But also it led to a lot of chaotic coalition governments. If you can't remember what a coalition government is, it's where two or more political parties have to join together because one of them doesn't have over 50% of the seats in the Reichstag. And of course, that happened throughout the Weimar period because it was impossible for any political party to get an overall majority. It was impossible for them to get more than 50%. You would have to get over 50% of the entire nation to vote for that one political party. And so throughout the Weimar period, there wasn't a single government that wasn't a coalition, not a single one. So that tells us that throughout the Weimar period, what we do see is a lot of different coalition governments that are chaotic, they cannot agree on matters, and it means that quite often they might be quite slow to deal with crises that they face throughout these years. The second constitutional issue was the Article 48. Now, Article 48 gave the president, who remember was the head of state, right to rule and to make any laws he wanted without the Reichstag in a time of emergency. Now, this was often abused by presidents. People like Aber abused this situation. Now, of course, you could say that this undermined democracy. How on earth is this a democratic republic if the president can take control and rule by himself without the Reichstag in a time of emergency? That in itself is not democratic, and it undermines democracy from the beginning. It perhaps even suggests that democracy doesn't work, particularly at times of emergency or crisis. The other constitutional weakness that you might be familiar with is that all judges and officials came from the Kaiser's time, and these guys hated the New Republic. Quite often they were very right-wing in their views, and therefore they openly supported right-wing rebels and terrorists that basically came out of this period. So for example, when we talk about people like Kapp and Hitler, who led right-wing rebellions, they were often let off with lighter sentences because the judges and officials that were part of their courtroom trials were more lenient towards their cause and supported them, their ideologies, their views. So essentially, that was another reason why there was a constitutional weakness, because it wasn't very fair. You've got to think about the fact that, in terms of the judges, they should have been completely non-biased to any rebellion that occurred in Weimar Germany. And of course, it did mean that if you were a left-wing rebel, you were going to be treated far more harshly than a right-wing rebel. Of course, that in itself is not fair at all. So in terms of moving on, guys, remember that you've got to have down the 3 key points about political problems in terms of constitutional weaknesses. So what were those weaknesses? Proportional representation, Article 48, and the fact that judges and officials were right-wing. Make sure you've got those 3 points down. Another political problem that the Weimar Republic faced was the lack of support from the German people from its beginnings. So we've got to think about, guys, the fact that the Weimar Republic was actually born out of defeat from the First World War, and so of course that meant that from the beginning a lot of Germans resented this new republic. Another reason why the German people resented this new republic was because they had signed the Treaty of Versailles in June 1919. Now, of course, we know that the Treaty of Versailles was humiliating for the German people, and so there was outcry in newspapers that vowed revenge. Now, newspapers, of course, reflected public opinion at this time, and so that told us that actually a lot of people in Germany found the Treaty of Versailles and even the creation of the Weimar Republic was actually humiliating to them, and therefore they were not really willing to support it. We also know that there were many right-wing nationalists in Germany, and these right-wing nationalists had said that the German army had not actually lost the First World War, instead it was stabbed in the back by the politicians, and it was the politicians who signed things like the Armistice and the Treaty of Versailles that had led to Germany's defeat and downfall. And that's another reason why the right-wing nationalists named some of these politicians November criminals. The November criminals name comes from the idea that the armistice was signed in November. So of course that tells us that these right-wing nationalists were certainly not supportive of this new Weimar Republic. Third point is about the fact that actually there were some nationalists, like Kapp, for example, Wolfgang Kapp, that was actually willing to rise in a rebellion against this government because of the Treaty of Versailles. Now, this was in 1920, and of course that meant it was shortly after the Treaty of Versailles was signed. Humiliation had come to light in the country, and Wolfgang Kapp had led the Freikorps against the government, essentially vowing to bring down the government as they had signed the Treaty of Versailles. So that tells us that some right-wing nationalists were so angry about this that they were willing to try and take on the government and overthrow this new republic. The third political problem that existed between 1919 and 1923 was the left-wing threat. This took form as the Spartacist uprising. The Spartacist uprising happened because some extreme left-wing Germans felt the revolution hadn't gone far enough. They wanted greater equality for the German people, especially the workers. They believed that this could only really be achieved by setting up a communist government that would be run by councils. Now, this happened in January 1919. Now, of course, this was a time in which the German government now wasn't firmly established, so they would struggle to deal with the rebellion at this time. So it seemed like the perfect opportunity for the rebels. The rebellion was led by Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht. They were charismatic leaders and they were extreme left-wing people, and they basically were able to gather 50,000 people to rebel in Berlin. Now, whilst in Berlin, the rebels were taking over newspaper buildings and things like that, marching on the city, and the government then needed to stop the rebels, and they didn't really have anyone to help them, so they asked the right-wing Freikorps to help them crush the rebellion. Now, the right-wing Freikorps were ex-military, they were unemployed soldiers, and so not only were they quite angry at the situation, but they also were angry at the communists. They wanted to crush the communists as they were their political rivals, and they did this brutally. They crushed the rebellion with force, and they killed around 100 people, and they executed the leaders, so Rosa and Karl were both brutally murdered. Now, in terms of considering the impact of the rebellion, obviously we need to think about the fact that this was a clash between the right and the left, so it could have actually led to a civil war between the two. And obviously we know that it made the government look weak. But one of the most important things that comes out of this is the impact on the Freikorps, because after this, the Freikorps felt really powerful. It gave them confidence to take on the government themselves, and that is what led to the Kapp Putsch in March 1920. Because the Freikorps had realised that the government weren't capable of crushing the left-wing threat, and so they hoped it meant that the government wouldn't be able to crush them either. Now, one thing I just want to point out at the end here, guys, is that this wasn't the last attempt of the communists, but it was their main opportunity. It is the main communist uprising that you need to know about. There were others that happened, for example, one in the Ruhr, but that's not one that we necessarily need to focus on for this part of the course. I really want you to make sure that you're just confident with the Spartacist uprising in particular. The fourth political problem between 1919 and 1923 was the right-wing threat, and this took form as the Kapp Putsch. Now, the right-wing threat sort of existed really from the beginning of the Weimar Republic's establishment, because we know that many Germans at the time held quite right-wing beliefs. Many of them wanted a strong government, many actually wanted a return of the Kaiser or something similar, and there were powerful people within government like the judiciary and even the army who were right-wing, and they hadn't been replaced as part of the new German Revolution. Of course, this caused problems for Weimar because it meant that these people did not support them. Instead, they wanted a return of something similar to the Kaiser's rule. And we also know that the Freikorps as a group were right-wing. We know they hated democracy and they wanted a strong Germany. But we also know that because they were ex-soldiers, they believed generally in the stab in the back myth. They believed that the German army was not responsible for the loss in World War I. They believed that the politicians had basically stabbed the army in the back and signed the armistice, making them the November criminals. Also, another reason why the Kapp Putsch occurred was because of the outrage of the Treaty of Versailles. Now, the Treaty of Versailles was signed on the 20th of June 1919, and of course, by the time the Kapp Putsch breaks out, it's March 1920, so it's shortly after. And these men that are part of the ex-military are essentially so angry and outraged at the fact that the military has been cut down to 100,000 men in the army in particular. That meant that they were willing to go against the government and overthrow them for their role in the Treaty of Versailles. So 5,000 of these men originally started the rebellion, and they were led by Wolfgang Kapp and General Luttwitz. Now, in terms of obviously the actual rebellion taking place, it was quite similar to the Spartacus rebellion in the sense that they were taking on Berlin, rioting through the streets, but this time they were armed and probably in some ways more dangerous because they were military trained men, but also they were taking over buildings and things like that. So the army, of course, would usually be brought in to crush a rebellion like this. At this time, the army refused to crush the rebellion because they said that troops don't shoot on troops. And essentially, you've got to remember that the Freikorps were ex-soldiers. Many of these men may have fought alongside each other in the First World War. And so at this time, the government was under increased pressure and they were worried for their lives. So the government actually fled to Dresden. They left Berlin. Of course, that made the government look extremely weak. Number one, because they don't have the support of the army, but number two, because they don't even stick around and they basically flee for their lives, which of course is probably necessary because their lives were in danger. But of course, at the time, that did definitely give them a poor reputation. Now, in terms of obviously the crushing of the Kapp Putsch, we know it was not done violently by the army. Instead, Eber calls upon the trade unions to mount a general strike. Now, this is really important because this is obviously how the rebellion ends. It's how Kapp realises that he cannot get control of the workers. Workers in Germany, of course, generally were perhaps more supportive of the central or right or left-wing groups. They were certainly not as supportive of the right-wing groups. And so what that meant is they were willing to support the trade union and obviously go on a general strike. And this was not really because they believed that the Weimar government was the best that it could be, and that they supported it, but they did feel that they did not want a military dictatorship, which is what would exist if the Kapp putsch did succeed. So the trade union strike actually lasted for about 4 days in Germany. There was no gas, no electricity, there was no transport, there was no water, nothing, and the city shut down. What this proved to Kapp was that he could not get control of the workers, and this meant that he himself had to flee. Now, in terms of punishment, Kapp was the only person that was punished for this. Basically, all the others got away with it, and this just encouraged further right-wing opposition because, of course, it was made quite clear that members of the judiciary, the judges, were definitely more right-wing, and they would support the right-wing movements in a way by not punishing them as much as they had done the left-wing. Let's not forget, guys, in the left-wing, Rosa and Karl were both brutally executed, and 100 other people were killed as part of this rebellion, whereas with the Kapp putsch, only Kapp is arrested and the rest of them get away with it. So I hope that gives you a bit more detail about why this political problem was a problem, because ultimately it just encouraged things like the Munich putsch later on in time. We're still looking at the fourth political problem for this slide, and the fourth political problem is the right-wing threat. Now, part of the right-wing threat was the political assassinations that occurred in the 1920s, of which there were 376 of them. 376 Weimar politicians were assassinated in the 1920s alone, and most of these assassinations were carried out by right-wingers. So a right-wing Freikorps group called the Organisation Consul basically assassinated government ministers like Erzberger and Rathenau as well. Now, these two men had been involved in the government. So, for example, Rathenau was the foreign minister, Erzberger had signed the armistice in November 1918, and so they were represented by the right-wing Freikorps group. And so when they were killed, of course, you would expect the Freikorps group to be punished for this crime because they had assassinated a politician. But instead, the assassins of politicians only on average got about 4 years imprisonment. Some people literally got away with murder. People didn't get any punishment whatsoever. And of course, what this tells us is that the Weimar Republic was essentially struggling with a legal system that was embedded with right-wing supporters who were allowing right-wingers to get away with murder, whereas if it was a left-wing rebel, they would not have got away with this. So for this next slide, we're still looking at the fourth political problem, the right-wing threat, but for this one, we're going to be looking at the rise of the Nazis, and we're also going to be looking at the Munich putsch, but we'll look at that on the next slide. So first of all, we know that Hitler was a right-wing German nationalist himself. He'd fought in World War I, and we know that he'd been awarded the Iron Cross twice. He was also blinded in a gas attack towards the end of the war as well. Now, at the end of the war in 1919, the army basically employed him to infiltrate and spy on the German Workers' Party, which was basically a political group. It was quite small in number, and it met in beer halls, and it generally just sat and talked about things like hatred of the Treaty of Versailles, communists, Jews, and this group was actually led by a man called Anton Drexler. Now, when Hitler heard the views of this party, rather than spying on them, he actually enjoyed what they talked about, and he thought it fitted with his own views. So in 1919, Hitler decided to join the party. But in 1920, he then took over leadership of the party, and he renamed it the National Socialist German Workers' Party, which was called the Nazis for short. He also decided to try and make it more popular by designing the swastika flag. This would make the party more eye-catching and people would know who they were. But also he issued the 25-point programme, and this was again supposed to tell the German people about what they hoped to implement if they became leaders. And a lot of these points were about making Germany strong again. And again, some of these ideas did appeal to lots of German people. Now, in terms of obviously some other things that Hitler did to kind of get out the views of the Nazi Party was things like obviously the speeches that he carried out, but also created things like the Munich Observer, the Nazi newspaper, which again people would read and it could tell more people about the views that the Nazis had. Now the party itself was actually based in Bavaria, not in Berlin. It was based in Munich. And essentially the party had been growing between 1919 and 1923. In 1923, it now had 55,000 members, and it also had 15,000 stormtroopers, which we also call the SA, or the brown shirts, because of the colour of their uniform. So we can see that the party was growing, and that was one of the reasons why Hitler then decided to perhaps launch the Munich Putsch in 1923, as he felt that essentially he now had enough supporters to take on the government. But we're going to look on the next slide at why this failed. We've just finished talking about the rise of the Nazis. What we're now going to be looking at is the Munich Putsch and what happened and how it was stopped. So first of all, the Munich Putsch took place in November 1923, and we also know that it took place in Bavaria in Munich. So again, it was not an attack on Berlin. So Hitler had basically planned a rebellion in Bavaria with the support of some other right-wing politicians. You might remember Gustav von Kahr, who was basically the governor of Bavaria, and he had originally planned to work with Hitler in this rebellion. They thought this would be a really good time to rebel because hyperinflation was still going on, and so the Weimar Republic at this time was really unpopular, and so Hitler and Kahr basically hoped that the people would be more inclined to join a rebellion at this time. So when Kahr basically decided he wasn't so sure about joining the rebellion, he started to hesitate, Hitler and 600 stormtroopers, remember they're the SA, burst into a meeting in a beer hall where von Kahr was speaking, and they forced him at gunpoint to declare a rebellion. The next day, the Nazis, supported by General Ludendorff, who was a war hero at the time, they decided to march on Munich. And they had actually been betrayed by von Kahr during this rebellion because he essentially, whilst being held, had managed to phone the armed police. And this is when the Nazis, of course, were defeated because the armed police arrived with notice of rebellion occurring. And then there was a short gun battle. 16 Nazis were killed, and so were 3 policemen as well. Hitler himself was arrested after this event. Now, of course, we know that the Munich Putsch wasn't successful in the short term because it failed, essentially. It had been defeated, and this was largely because of Kahr phoning the authorities. But actually, the Munich Putsch had a number of important long-term consequences. So when we think about what those consequences were, the most important one really is Hitler himself gaining a lot of publicity during the trial. His trial became a media sensation. It definitely got him a lot more perhaps support, but even if it wasn't support, people knew who he was, and that obviously helped him later on down the line. We also know that whilst he was in prison, he was treated very fairly. We know, for example, that he was given quite a comfortable cell. He was given fresh flowers every day. He was allowed as many visitors as he wanted. And one of his visitors, of course, would help him to write his autobiography, Mein Kampf, which, of course, would outline his ideas. And by 1925, it had become a bestseller. And so what we know is that although the Munich Putsch had failed in the short term, it was not a success, but actually in terms of the long term, it had gained the Nazis more publicity, and it would continue to do so because whilst in prison, of course, Hitler did manage to write his own book. It's also important that we know that the problems that were caused by this is, again, the highlighting of the unfairness of the judicial system. Again, we know that Hitler basically was given a prison sentence. He was sentenced to 5 years, but he only actually served 9 months of that time. This again is an example of treason. He tried to take on the government. He tried to overthrow the government, but he still was only given 9 months in prison. And even then, it was also a comfortable sentence in a comfortable cell. So that basically tells us a lot about the system itself and the support again for right-wing rebellion. Now, essentially, one of the most important things that Hitler learns from this is the fact that he was not able to gain power through a revolution. Okay, Hitler had realised that he'd ended up in prison, and yes, the sentence was short, but he knew, therefore, that having violent protest was not going to work. It hadn't worked for the other groups before him either. And so Hitler had decided after this point that he was going to have to get power legally. Now, what this meant is he was going to have to win the people over democratically by gaining their votes. And this was the only way he knew the Nazis were going to be able to gain political power and control. And so actually, again, Munich Putsch was an important turning point for the Nazi Party overall. We're now going to move on to looking at the economic problems of the new Weimar Republic, particularly from 1919 to 1923. And one of the first initial economic issues was, of course, debt from the war and reparations set from the Treaty of Versailles. So that's our first issue. Now, it's important we recognise, guys, that reparations actually were not set properly until 1921. When the Germans first signed the Treaty of Versailles, they were signing a blank cheque. They knew they were going to have to pay reparations, but they didn't know how much it would be until 1921. Even before reparations were announced, Germany was still in a very difficult financial position. We know that they owed about 1.44 billion marks in debt, and of course that was going to be quite difficult after industries had been affected by the war, and of course they had to rebuild their economy at that stage. Obviously, we then know that the Treaty of Versailles stated that they would need to pay reparations from June 1919. So then that was kind of lingering over the Germans, even though they didn't know how much they were going to have to pay. They knew they were going to have to pay quite a huge amount of reparations. And then from 1921, when they found out it was going to be 6.6 billion, of course, that would shatter the economy even further. And on top of that, we know German currency was not to be used for this. It was going to be used in gold and industrial goods. So particularly their industrial areas of their country were going to be working hard, but to pay off the reparations for the war, which of course was very unpopular. And at this stage as well, Germany was also suffering from inflation. We know that their prices were going up for years, and of course that was about to spiral further out of control in the next stage of the issue. So that's our first point. We're going to move on to our next economic issue. The second economic problem of the Weimar government was actually the invasion of the Ruhr. Now, if you remember, the invasion of the Ruhr took place in January 1923, and the invasion took place because the Germans had basically paid their first payment of 50 million to the Allies, and then basically in 1922 they were unable to pay their second reparation payment, and of course this then meant that the French and Belgian troops invaded the Ruhr. Now, it's important that we understand that this was completely legal according to the Treaty of Versailles. The Ruhr was an industrial heartland of Germany, and remember that the Germans were paying their reparations largely through gold and goods. So we know that basically in the Treaty of Versailles, it had stated as a clause that if the Germans had failed to pay their reparations themselves, that the French and Belgian troops had the right to invade the Ruhr, to take it and seize it themselves. And so whilst the French were in the Ruhr, they were seizing things like coal and manufactured goods as payment for reparations. Now, of course, this was incredibly unpopular in Germany. The German government was in a really difficult position. They didn't want to risk war with the French, but they basically ordered their workers to passively resist. That means to strike. So they asked their workers to strike and not produce any goods for the French and Belgian troops to take. And they told the workers that they would pay them to strike as well. Now, of course, this meant that the French and Belgian government just sending their own workers to basically continue to carry out the work, whilst the German workers were on strike. But this strike actually did cause further resentment between the Germans and the French and Belgian troops. And as a result, 132 people were actually killed in this, and 150,000 people were expelled from the region as well. So it actually was quite a dangerous event in which a 7-year-old child was actually also killed. So what we can then see is that this then becomes an economic issue because there was, of course, a huge loss of industrial production. for the German people. Any industry that was being produced was actually being sent off to France and Belgium, and the French and Belgian troops and workers were doing all of this themselves. And on top of this, the government was printing more money to pay the striking workers, which of course caused hyperinflation, because the more money that they printed off, the more worthless the money became. And that leads me on to my third economic issue, which was hyperinflation from 1923. So hyperinflation had basically ruined people's finances. Prices rose significantly during this time. So for example, a price of a loaf of bread went from 1 mark to 200 billion marks. That is a huge increase. Of course, people therefore, if they wanted to go out and buy a loaf of bread, would have to take their money around in wheelbarrows or suitcases to basically carry the money, because you couldn't possibly fit it in like a wallet or a purse. So basically people were, carrying around their wages in wheelbarrows, carrying around their shopping money in wheelbarrows, and people wouldn't bother to steal it because it was ultimately worthless. Money instead could be used as toys or fuel. So for example, you might have seen quite famous pictures of children playing with blocks of money as a toy. On top of that, you might have seen people throwing money onto a fire, because of course the money was worthless. A newspaper, however, was actually worth more. So German people would choose to throw loads of just banknotes onto the fire as opposed to throwing their recent newspaper on there instead. Now, the people, of course, we have to look at particularly as the losers in this situation are people on fixed incomes. So those people, for example, are going to be your pensioners, your war widows. These people will have had a set amount of money paid to them every week, for example. So if you're going to be a pensioner, and let's say you get 100 marks a week as a pension, well, that isn't going to change. So, for example, if you want to buy a loaf of bread, you're doomed. You can't possibly buy a loaf of bread that costs 200 billion marks when you're only getting paid 100 marks every week. Now, of course, there were also other people that completely suffered from hyperinflation. For example, the middle classes. The middle classes were quite often the groups that were saving their money. Well, again, if you were a saver and you had 50,000 marks in the bank, you now couldn't buy a single egg with that money. You couldn't buy a loaf of bread with that money. So your life savings were virtually worthless. You can imagine how completely devastated those people were. However, there were some people that benefited. For example, people that had huge loans, were in debt or had mortgages, they benefited. You've got to think, guys, again, similar to what I was saying a moment ago, if you were in 50,000 marks worth of debt, that didn't change. You could pay that off with one quick banknote now. It was basically nothing. So you can understand essentially how some people did benefit and some people suffered as a result of hyperinflation. Now, of course, hyperinflation then caused other political problems. So, for example, there was social chaos, there were riots and looting, and people blaming the government for this, which, to be fair, they had a point, because the government, of course, had been printing money to pay the striking workers that they had told to go on strike. So, of course, people blaming the government then became a huge issue for Weimar, and it lost popularity. Now, in terms of obviously hyperinflation, it of course was not only just causing economic issues, but also did cause things like the Munich Putsch. We know from the last slide that the Munich Putsch was caused because the Nazis felt that this was the perfect opportunity to take over the government and get support of the working people in Germany, who perhaps felt that they had suffered heavily from hyperinflation. Of course, there were also some communist rebellions as well in Saxony, which again were rioting against the issues being caused by the current Weimar government. So I hope that helps you to understand that although these could be classed as some political issues, they are economic problems that then lead to political problems further down the line. Okay, year 11, we've finished now going through the beginnings of the Weimar government, and we've also talked about the crisis years of 1919 to 1923. What I would now like you to do, to make sure that you're really confident with your knowledge now, and to give you something to go over in the future, I'd like you to make a revision resource that you can basically use to go back over what happened in each different area, and also why it was a problem for the government. So on Show My Homework, you will notice that there is a document attached, and it will look like the chart that is just on this picture here. And essentially you just need to fill that in with very brief notes about what happened in each rebellion. So just bullet point things like where did it happen, when did it happen, who was leading it, how many people were involved. And then you've also got to talk about obviously why it was a problem for the government, and you'll particularly be looking at how it was crushed, particularly if you're looking at a political issue. If you're looking at an economic problem, like later down the line, the invasion of the Ruhr, hyperinflation and things like that, you will also have to think about why those issues were a problem for the government. So think about the resentment after hyperinflation in particular. If you need to go back over this PowerPoint at any point, you can just rewind the video and listen to certain sections again if you need to do that to help you complete your charts. But I would really recommend that you complete this, as it will be something that will help you to consolidate your knowledge now, but it will also be really useful in the future. We are going to continue our knowledge of Weimar Germany in our next lesson, so I will speak to you all again then. Take care.